In this video, we will see how to add global default error handler to your Express application, so if any type of error happens in your application will not stop, and it will continue to serve the requests. So let's comment out the get-to-dos catch handler and see what happens. If I make mistake of typing to-dos instead of to-do model and send the get-to-dos API request, you can see we're not getting any request, as our application has crashed because we don't have any error handler to handle that error. So none of the other APIs will work as our application has stopped working. So anywhere in your application, if something goes wrong, you should add a default error handler to handle that error. If any error happens in your application, we should handle that by sending back some default error message. So let me bring back that catch handler. And to add a global error handler in our application, Express.js provides a way by adding a middleware function. As we have seen in one of the previous video, we can add a middleware using app.use method. And that handler function will automatically receive request, response, and next as the parameters. And if we pass the first parameter an object of type error, then that function will act as error handler function. And you also need to make sure to add this middleware after all your roots of the application. Probably the best place it before the app.listen method. Inside this function, if there is some error, then for now, we will just log it to the console. Now, to trigger this error handler, we need to call the next method and pass the error object as an argument to it. Right now what is happening is we're not sending any error message back in the send method. So if I send the get-to-dos request, you can see we're getting an internal server error, but we're not getting any error message indicating the issue. So if you're using this API in your front-end application, you should display some error message in case of server error, and right now you can't do that because we're not sending back any error message. So instead of this line, we can call next method and pass error object to it, so our default error handler will be executed. And we will access next function from the third parameter. And for next, we can pass error object with some error message. Let's say, error while getting list of to-dos. So by saying new error, we're specifically saying it as error object, so Express.js will automatically call this error handler by passing the error object as the first parameter. And we will see that error message in the console. So when I send the request again, we're not getting anything back, because we're not sending anything back, as we have commented out the send method. But if we check the console, you can see that the console log we added is printing that actual error we sent. So now, we can take out that error message using the message property of that error. And if the message is not provided, we will add a default error message of something went wrong. Try again later. And we will take error status code from the status property of error object. And if user has not provided any error status code, we will default to 500. Now, we can send back the error message and status using response.status, and we will pass that status variable value. And we will call send method by passing that message variable value. And if I send the request again, you can see we're getting error message back, error while getting list of to-dos. So using this way, you can add a default error handler for your entire application, and this error handler will be automatically called when we pass an error object to the next method. Now, let's add the same line of code for add-to-do handler also. And we will access the next from third parameter. But this is time-consuming to create new error object every time to specify error. Here also I want to send error back, so again you need to create that error object. And here we're also not specifying the HTTP status code, like this status code of 400. So instead of manually doing all this work, we can create a new function in functions.js file. We can call the function getErrorMessage and it will accept an object as a parameter. This object will have a status property with default value of 500 and also a message property. Inside this function, we can create an error object using newError. Now, for this error object, we can set status property with value coming from status parameter. And message property we will set to message parameter. Now we will return this error object from this function. And we also need to export this getErrorMessage function so we can use it in other files. Now, in getToDo's function, instead of using newError, I will call the getErrorMessage function. And I will pass an object with message property. I will copy that previous error message. Let me add an exclamation mark in the message so we will know that the error message comes from here only. And now, if we send the getToDo's request, you can see we're getting the error message we just specified. So this is a better way rather than manually specifying new error object. And we can also provide a status property with value of, let's say, 400. Right now the default status is 500, but if I send the request again, you can see it's 400. So with this getErrorMessage function, we can provide our own message and status also. But I always need to pass an object to the getErrorMessage function even if it's an empty object. Let's say I don't pass anything to this function, and if I send the request again, you can see the application has crashed because there is an error. Cannot read properties of undefined reading status. We're getting error because we're destructuring status from object which does not exist, because while calling this method, we're not passing the object. So to fix this, we can assign a default value of empty object while defining the function itself, and destructuring an empty object does not throw an error. And now, if we send the request again, the application will not break. As you can see, we're correctly getting the error message which is as expected. And now the application is not crashing, so I can make other requests also without any issue. So now, user don't have to provide any argument to the function if you want to display default server message. So if we don't specify any message, we're displaying something went wrong message. And if we don't provide status, we default to 500 status value. So in that function, we also don't need to provide any default value. Because in the error handler function, we're assigning a default value of 500. So, if I clear the console and send the request again, you can see we're getting default 500 internal server error. But I don't want to display default error message for getToDo's. Always display the error message specific to that route. So I will provide a message property here. And one thing you need to remember is that never directly send back error.message. Because it might tell more information about your database fields, structure of your database, and other things from just the error messages. So if some hacker is trying to access your database, he will get to know that there is some to-dos in your code, and by sending different data and requests, the hacker will be able to find more details about it. So never use error.message to send back actual error message. Instead, send error message specific to your root handler. We can say something like error while getting list of to-dos, try again later. So when I send the request again, I will get that error message back. Now, I will copy this code and add it for add to do handler. Here I will say error while adding list of to-dos. And if I send the add to do request, you can see it's successful because all the values we sent are correct. Now, if I make the title more than 20 characters, it should fail, because we have added max length validation for title. If I send the request now, you can see we correctly get the error message for validation failure. So this error message is coming because of the max length validation, as you can see here. Now, if I change the property from title to some invalid property name like titles, then we should get error message. So in add to do handler, we're manually sending back that error message. Instead, we can use our custom function in the next method. This time, we will also specify the status code of 400. And if I send the request again, you can see it still works. Now, let's do the same for update to do handler. Let's test the update to do request now. So when I send the invalid property, we should get error message for that. Looks like we have used wrong to do ID. So let's get one from the get to do's request. Oh, we forgot to change the to-do's model name back to to-do. Now, let's use this to-do ID in the update request. The application is broken, let's see what happened. Oh, we forgot to get the next parameter. Now you can see, we're correctly getting the error message for the invalid titles property we used to update. If we correct that, you can see, the update is successful. Now we can update this error message also. Now, instead of this 7.6, I will use 4.8, and if I send the request, you can see we're getting please enter valid to do error message, which is as expected. You also need to remember that the ID we're passing is of object ID type, which is always a 12-byte auto-generated ID. So if we try to add some extra characters, it will fail. As you can see here, we're getting error message and our application is not breaking because of the global error handler now. Now let's call the same error message validation for delete to do handler. You can also add a return keyword here if you want, but as this is the last statement, it's not required. Now, let's add the validation here also. Let's verify the delete request now. Application is broken again because we missed accessing next parameter again. Now you can see we're getting validation error for invalid to do, which is as expected. Let's take some valid to do ID and try the delete request again. I will take the last to do ID ending with 8F. As you can see, the to-do is successfully deleted, which we can verify through get to-do's root. You can see, we don't have that to-do now. So we're done with the error handling. One thing you need to remember is that you need to call the next method with error object to trigger our global default error handler. If you check the Express.js version, we're using version 4. If you search for npm express, you can see we're using the latest version of Express.js. But there is also a beta version for version 5 of Express.js for future release, which can install using npm install express at 5.0 beta version. In this future version of Express.js, we don't need to manually call the next method with error object to execute the error handler. So whenever any root handler function or middleware function returns a promise. So when you declare any function as async, it will automatically return a promise. And if any error occurs in that function, the next method will be automatically called to execute our global default error handler. So in upcoming version 5, the default global error handler will be automatically executed when any middleware or handler function returns a promise, and if that promise fails because of some error. Now, we can send the get to-do's request again. First, let's create some error condition. We will rename to-do to to-do's. If I send the request again, you can see the error message, to-do's is not defined. So in version 5, the application will not break because of the error if that handler function is returning a promise, and our error handler will be executed in case of any error. But we should not send the exact error message in the response, so it's always better to manually call the next method with exact error message we want. But this is a beta version that is not yet completely ready, so let's install the previous version 4 again. And in this version 4, if we don't call next method with error object, the application will break, which is not the case with version 5. So if I send the request again with this commented code, you can see the application has stopped. So let's remove the commented code. And if we send the request again, you can see that the application is not crashing. And I can fix that error now. You can see, we don't have any error now. If you found this video useful, do like the video and don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you will not miss future video notifications.